Hey up and welcome to the Temple of Bleh, episode U. It's another entry into the history of Roadrunner Records. This time I'm speaking with Richard Bengloff. Now Richard is an amazingly interesting character, and his particular chapter in this story is when he was the chief financial officer of Red, Relativity Entertainment Distribution, between 1991 and 1993. So Red were the distributors of Roadrunner's records, no pun intended, across the North American territories. If you recall from previous episodes, we talk about when Holly and Steve set up the US office. It was off the back of a deal with Important Records. That's who's going to distribute those records in North America. That's where the foothold starts. Important then turns into Red. So that's where Richard stands in. And it's an incredibly interesting dude. In fact, let me just give you a quick sort of rundown of his CV, effectively. So from Red, he was Vice President of the Distribution Operations at Sony, the Senior Vice President and Chief Financial Officer of Warner Music Group and Elektra Entertainment Group, sorry. Moving on, President of the American Association of Independent Music, representing all kinds of independent labels. The guy's an absolute titan of the industry, and he really gives me an education as to how that side of the business works. So you'll be seeing a lot more of this kind of conversation going on for this podcast. If it's not for you and you like to stick with the music stuff, that's cool, man. Let's move on. But if you like to get in the weeds with me, get out your calculators and crack on and join me for a lovely conversation with the amazing and mighty Richard Bengloff. 1, 2, fuck shit up.
Here we
there
go.
we go. Right.
How are you doing, Jim?
Not too bad, Richard. Yourself?
Good. Where are you?
I'm just outside Old York in the north of England.
Okay.
How about yourself?
Sure. I'm in New York City.
Right bang in the middle?
What?
Right bang in the middle of the city, or are you?
I'm actually in Lower Manhattan. I don't know if you've ever been to New York, but it's more of a neighborhood than you would think of when you think of Manhattan. Not big buildings, little buildings.
I'm fascinated by Manhattan just because of the grid layout. The only grid layout we see in Europe is some of the old fort cities like the ones in Malta. And I haven't been to New York. I nearly went a few years ago, but I'm keen to see the layout.
It's more of a neighborhood that you would envision. I actually grew up here, so it's... there's the local pizzeria and there's the local supermarket, and has more of a neighborhood feel than a New York City feel.
Yeah, good stuff. I'll just give you a bit of some context on the project that I'm working on. But I do appreciate you sort of clarifying your relationship with the label. Prior to us setting up the meeting. So what the idea behind this project for me is I'm interviewing people who had any kind of relationship with the business side of Roadrunner, because I'm trying to figure out. The label itself had a particularly strong impact on me as a brand because I'm a metal guy, and the lifespan of that label from 1980 to 2012 as an independent, it just intrigues me as to how it did what it did, because metal is a fringe genre as it stands, and Roadrunner it certainly had an identity, unlike say conglomerates that had metal bands like your EMIs and maybe even your Virgins and things like that. So I'm trying to untangle how it happened. Was it an accident? Was it meticulous design by Case that we had like a really strong metal brand which had the impact and the value that it did? And the reason I'm intrigued from your perspective, Richard, is simply because I've been binging on the A2IM interviews and conference keynote speeches and things like that. And I feel like one of the peripheral questions I'm trying to answer is, what is the value of a label? And I feel that's right in your wheelhouse. So I thought if I could split it into sort of two bits, really. One is, let's talk about Roadrunner, your memories of that time. And then another one is just, let's pretend we're in kindergarten and some kids just asked you how distribution works and why this stuff is kind of important. If that's cool.
Of course, whatever you like. But I guess I also, I'm retired, but I still teach, and I teach the music industry. And what I do is old school, new school. So maybe that's the best way for my students. I teach at a couple of universities here in New York City, part-time.
Okay.
and it's probably the best way to explain the industry then and the industry now, and how things have changed. It's funny because nowadays, when you hear about music labels, you always hear the phrase of branding
Hmm.
because everything's oriented to branding nowadays. I never heard that phrase ever 30 years ago. In terms of the only times you hear branding is when we were talking about some food item
Yeah.
or something of that type. But it wasn't really marketing, but it was a brand, and Roadrunner was very much a brand at the time.
Hmm.
But I guess starting even one step before that, back then, now everybody has access, right? You
Hmm.
go on the internet, you could talk directly with your fans. The last 5 years, you could talk back and forth with your fans like a Taylor Swift does or any metal band. Metallica does,
Yeah.
talks to their fans. And back then, there really was no internet to speak of in the early 90s. Email really didn't start taking off until the middle 90s.
Hmm.
And so you had no direct access to your fans. There were four things that were important if you were a music label to be able to make a living. One was to get radio play, which was somewhat more limited to for metal because of the nature of some of the lyrics and everything else. But it had its niches and it had shows. SOU was a huge station here in the New York market, and it was very important. Second was to get press. Third was to tour, which is the only time you really had direct contact with your fans, but you had to let them know when you were going to tour.
Mm.
So you had to do that through the press, right? Otherwise, they wouldn't have known. I mean, it's sort of archaic, kind of cute, I guess, at this point. We used to send postcards out when the bands were going out again. I mean, in addition to IRD being a distributor, which was started by an Englishman. I don't even know if you're aware of that. It was a company called Pinnacle.
Oh,
A
really?
fellow by the name of Steve Mason in the UK, Pinnacle's the name of the company, was exporting music to the US
Oh,
and was selling through what was called rack jobbers back then. Not rack jobbers, but one stops, selling
right.
to one stops. And after a while, Steve Mason said, gee, instead of me going through these one stops, maybe I should just start my own distribution company in the United States.
Mm.
And he did, and that distributor was Important Record Distributors, which Steve owned up until about 1990 when I
Right.
first
Okay.
came in this scene.
Oh, is that
But
before he?
Pinnacle was a major British music company, not major in terms of Universal Music, but what
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
saying is of the independents, Pinnacle was a very big name.
Okay.
And so he started the company, and they hired a fellow by the name of Barry Coburn, who was one of the buyers at the one stop he was selling to start Important Record Distributors for him. I guess it was back in 1979. So it was quite a while ago. And but back then, so you had to get on the radio, you had to get publicity, press, which weren't blogs, it was physical press at the time.
Yeah.
You had to tour. And the last thing you needed was distribution. And distribution today is more of a commodity, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, for under $100, you can get on you can get on Spotify, and you can get on Apple, and you can get on Amazon, you can get on all the different services around the world, Boomplay in Africa and QQ Music in China, etc. But back then, there were barriers to entry. So distribution was very, very important. There were 6 major label distributors back then. Today, there's only 3.
Okay.
And there really were 2 major independent distributors, Important Record Distributors and Caroline, which was also a British company, which interestingly enough. So both of the independent distributors were spin-offs effect. Caroline was started by Richard Branson. That's a name you're
All right.
familiar with.
Yeah.
So, and both still exist today. Red is, IRD morphed into Red and is now part of a company called The Orchard. But And then now there's others because there's less barriers to entry. And you got known as certain brands. And IRD, for whatever reason, they had their own label called Relativity.
Yeah.
And the Relativity label had bands like Corrosion of Conformity. You familiar with them?
Look, that's one of my favorite bands.
I've actually I'm not a big metalhead, but I used to go see the acts. And a whole bunch of metal brands evolved during that period. Roadrunner was one of them in the 80s.
Combat,
this is leading up to when I get involved.
Yeah.
Metal Blade.
Yep.
Century Media, Oliver Whithoff, may rest in peace, was actually a close friend of mine for a long period of time. One of the two founders with Robert Kampf of Century Media Records. And these were brands. We didn't call them brands back then. But the kids, if I went to a show for Cannibal Corpse, they might as well have been wearing a Metal Blade T-shirt as much as a Cannibal Corpse T-shirt.
Yeah.
And through a fellow by the name of Alan Becker, who you must speak to, who was really the key person at IRD Red for getting these labels and retaining labels, and effectively, he was an artist and repertoire person for labels. He would do an assessment as to whether or not the label was an appropriate label to bring in. Are they going to be successful? Are they not going to be successful? And then he'd do the relationships, and then he'd actually do A&R for the labels. They'd send him copies of tapes and CDs to listen to if he thought they were.
If you hear me tapping, I'm just taking notes because these are awesome questions for Alan as well. Like, how would he assess them? What kind of stuff was it when the Roadrunner gig started and things like that? So if you hear me tapping away, I am just taking notes.
But I'd say the leader, not because of what you're doing the study, but I'd say the leader of independent metal music was certainly Roadrunner. The Obituaries, the Deicides, the Life of Agony. They just Sepultura, of course, which was their biggest artist. And it's funny you talk about metal. The majors really didn't know what to do with it. I had alluded to it in the email I sent you. They upstreamed a Sepultura record for a lot of money case to Epic Records, and Epic Records really didn't know what to do with it, so it got sent back down.
I think the story behind that was Sepultura just thought they should try it out and see if they got a different experience, and then the champion at the label at Epic, as sometimes it is with major levels, there was a revolving door, and he was championing them on the Friday, but he was out the door on the Monday. So they were like, "Oh, I guess we're stuck in an album cycle with Epic with no one."
Well, I can actually share with you because I became the chief financial officer of Sony Music Distribution, and I can tell you they wouldn't have known what to do with it. If he was there or wasn't there, it really wouldn't have made that big a deal.
Fair enough.
Felix had grandeur as to what he would do, but he should have always stayed and did. And then he went to, I guess, Soulfly was the group that was the spinoff.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not a metal fan, but I do know the history.
Yeah.
But distribution was very important. And it was very archaic back then. We used to literally buy the CDs and tapes. We just distribute them. In other words, Roadrunner would sell us a CD for $6.
Right. Okay.
We would sell it to a retailer for $7.50, and the retailer would turn around and sell it for $11.98 in the U.S. market. U.S. dollars I'm talking about in this example that I'm sharing.
Let's strip this entire bit back. This is exactly the question I was going to ask, like the life cycle of a record through a distribution arm. Because one thing I did do is crunch the numbers against Metal Blade, Combat, SPV, Neat Records. And one thing Roadrunner had in spades ever since the start of their tenure in 1980 was, in terms of actual products going out the door, doesn't matter about direct signings or otherwise, in terms of actual collateral going out the door and making the money, they were always miles ahead of everyone else. I think the closest,
no question.
Yeah, I think they didn't even think about direct signings until about 1983. So they had 3 years of just churning out records, just churning them out. So I'll be interested knowing that that's where the main revenue stream was coming from, and continued really up until about 2012. They still did a lot of the heavy lifting on distribution up until the end of their independent era. let's do a model. Let's say I'm Case and I'm coming to you saying, let's start from the very start. When the arrangement happens, is Red under an obligation to distribute anything that Roadrunner throws at them?
Yes. There was never a problem with, the material. Certain retailers, there were rack jobbers, for example, who rack jobbed Walmart, which still is the biggest chain here in the United States. And if there was an artist like Brujeria, I don't know if you know who they are, with the cover with the guy's head cut off, Walmart wouldn't carry that. Right. But otherwise, everyone would carry everything that was put out. Occasionally, they'd have to put out a version with this explicit lyrics sticker. I don't know if you've seen those.
The PMRC advisory stuff, yeah.
Yes, explicit lyrics. Well, no. We do a separate version, but Roadrunner knew the kids didn't want that version, so we wouldn't put that version out. But I mean, the key guy for Roadrunner at the time, Case, was very involved.
Yeah.
Number one, they could afford to do everything because they were the first one who understood the international scope of what was going on. I don't know if it was because they were based in Europe originally, but they had the most extensive label network. So they had really leveraged themselves, right? They knew they were going to sell a certain amount in Australia, New Zealand, a certain amount in Japan, a certain amount in Europe, a certain amount in South America. That's where they were always going to be profitable.
Yeah.
While the U.S. may have been their largest market, they had enough in the other markets. It was almost like insurance against a failure.
Yeah.
They had the brand, so whatever they put out, everyone was interested in, and there was and the key guy on their end, sort of a different skill set than Alan Becker on the Red side, is Doug Keogh, who was their general manager for many, many years.
Yeah.
And Doug had in addition to being a huge fan of the music and understanding what would sell and what wouldn't sell, Doug also had and has, he and I are still friends to this day, an uncanny business sense of what should be done. And it's funny because the first time I met with Case and Doug was in 1990. And they were going to leave IRD Red. They weren't getting paid on a timely basis because the way it worked is that we were buying CDs, cassettes, whatever it was, and we were supposed to pay them within 60 days, and all of a sudden we were paying them in 90 days, 100 days, 120 days. So they weren't getting paid. And I said, well, this is insanity. We can't pay you for the inventory that's sitting on our shelves, and we're not getting paid by the retailers for 60, 90 days. So I literally was with IRD Red for less than a week when I had that first meeting with Case and Doug, and found that we had to redo our deal. And they're both great guys, businessmen, but also human beings. Sometimes they both don't mesh. And we had a patience. I put in the contract that if we didn't fulfill what we said we were going to do, we had no systems. There were a lot of problems with IRD back then. They can get out of the contract, which they didn't have to do because we did fulfill the systems and the payment terms and the distribution that we had. And we switched from a method of buying CDs to just give us your CDs on consignment.
Okay.
We'll ship them to stores. When we bill them, we'll pay you within a certain number of days after we do the billing, and then it's our problem to collect them.
The interesting thing
may be too mundane for you. I apologize.
No, this is exactly what I'm wanting to talk about. I'm a very mundane person. My background's in intellectual property and copyright law, so this stuff to me is fascinating. So the way in my head when I was trying to sort of paint a picture in my mind of how that relationship would work, I always assumed that it would be the label contracting a distributor to fulfill a distribution of a certain product, and then make some money, on the dollar on that. I didn't think it was, how to describe it? I thought the label was vending a service from the distributor, not the distributor buying a product from the label, if that makes sense. I always thought that the distributor would handle the manufacturing and distribution, but it sounds like what you're saying is a distributor would actually take the brick and mortar, the actual product, and then deal with it themselves.
Right. What you're describing, there were two types of deals.
Oh, I love this.
One was a distribution deal.
Mm-hmm.
So our distribution deal with Roadrunner Records was, if we bill $10 for a CD, we're going to keep 16% of that, which was a great rate, but they were a great label. Mm-hmm. And we would remit the other 84 cents to them for every dollar that we sold. Mm-hmm. They would manufacture the CDs, cassettes, and the music. Mm-hmm. They would deliver them to our warehouse. Mm-hmm. Our warehouse would then keep an inventory. We'd get orders from physical retailers like Tower Records that no longer exist. Mm-hmm. We would ship the appropriate amount of those recordings to the retailers, because what they don't sell, they can return. They have 100% return privileges still to this day.
Okay.
So the risk was Roadrunners, but we, as their good partner, don't want to ship too much, but you want to ship enough so that when they walk into the store and they want typo negative, it's not just in the browser under the letter T. Mm-hmm. They have a stack of maybe 10 of them. So in a way, that's an advertisement, right? Oh, yeah. Look, there's 10 of those sitting there. Flip it over. Oh, there's that Roadrunner logo, or there's that Century Media logo, or there's that Metal Blade logo. Mm-hmm. We actually, as part of our label, not as a distributor, had Earache back then.
Right, cool.
And in addition to Combat, which was our own label, as you noted earlier. But so we did all these things. And that was the method. The other type of deal was called a pressing and distribution deal. Mm-hmm. In that case, we would manufacture on someone else's behalf, because they did, maybe they were just a A&R, a talent, A&R artist and repertoire. I'm sure you know what that means. They would be they were really an A&R source, and they would do marketing, but they didn't want to be involved in the back room, the day-to-day. So we would press, but then we may charge them a 25% fee, in addition to the cost of whatever it is it cost us to manufacture. And we got better manufacturing rates because we made a lot of CDs.
And I guess that's easier for you guys, though, because Relativity and Important were one and the same, I think. Whereas not every label had its own distribution built in.
Yeah, well, there was, as I said, there were really only ourselves and Caroline were the two main distributors back then, because most people didn't have relationships with the retailers.
Yeah.
And the retailers didn't want to open up new relationships. They wanted to deal with a small group of distributors, because they didn't want to get involved in dealing with 100 different people buying their music from. They wanted to deal with 10 people, 12 people. There were others, smaller ones, Cargo. But so in a way, when Roadrunner was going to leave, one of the places they were looking at was one of the majors. And they had actually gotten into negotiations with them, but they were afraid for IRD Red. They were our most important distributed label.
Right, okay.
For a lot of distribution back then wasn't exclusive either. Mm-hmm. A lot of times it was split up between Caroline would distribute the same ones as we distributed.
Yeah.
Roadrunner was an exclusive relationship. And so those are the two type of deals. We really didn't like doing pressing and distribution deals. Mm-hmm. We preferred to just be a distributor and focus on working with the accounts, coordinating the labels marketing.
Mm-hmm. I guess it's kind of like, that's a really important point of how on the distribution deal, the manufacturing would come from the label side, because that means Roadrunner can decide on their own margins on the manufacturing. Like, for example, in the Typo Negative sense, where they were very meticulous about their artwork, everything had to be green and black and a particular shade of green. Obviously, Doug's there going, all right, well, why buy cyan ink when we can buy green ink and we could save some money on that? And then once you save 10 cents per CD and you sell a million, you've saved $100,000.
No question. Doug he's still around. He's retired as well.
Yeah.
But was really smart about how much he spent on the artwork. What you just described. But was also very cognizant of artist relations, as we all had to be. Mm-hmm. And was also, Roadrunner was also excellent. Jonas, who became the general manager after Doug, was the head of marketing, and he was excellent. And Jonas would coordinate, here's what we're doing, and they're going on tour, so make sure these markets, that there's plenty of music available in the stores for those markets, or here's where we're getting radio play. So based on that radio play, it all has to be coordinated or you waste a lot of money. To your point, it's not just the 10 cents, which is very important. You're talking to the CFO, remember. But in addition to that was, if you're going to spend money on marketing, you want to make sure you get a bang for your buck.
Yeah.
And you want to make sure, which was very different than now, because now you know what happens the next day, because so much of it's via social media, which is great. In terms of market efficiency, you can see what's going on where, which parts of the country, who the audience is, what their zip codes are in the U.S. Back then, you were relying more on radio play, where it was starting to sell, replenishing the inventory, where the tour is going, what magazines. Again, we didn't have direct relationship with the fans. We used to buy a lot of Guitar World ads to announce when new records were coming out. Now you don't have to do that anymore. You just, go on social media and let everyone know what's going out.
Yeah. People tend to pick their information streams more specifically, which I guess is sometimes a challenge. And again, when I was talking about what's the value of a label, it's maybe we'll come to this on another further down the line. But today, when there's a more DIY aspect for bands, as you sort of said, you can just do everything on social media and the analytics are there straight away. I'm kind of I'm empathizing with labels a lot more when the typical default position of a DIY band is, well, the label's just a middle manager. And you think, well, now I'm thinking it's not a middle manager. It's a room full of absolute experts who are responding to the market with the correct vocabulary and the correct lexicon immediately to understand how they can reverse engineer your particular band and create a product and make it actually viable. That's what I think labels do. If you were to say, what does a label actually do and why is it important these days? And I think the answer is they understand more. And they can kind of understand what it is you're trying to sell, I think.
I would say absolutely. Mm-hmm. If you remind me, I teach, and one of my classes is, do you need a label? What do you get and what do you give away? If you remind me, I'll send you the piece of paper I share with my students.
Yes.
But more than that, before it used to be getting you on the radio, right? Because SOU was a big metal station here in the New York market. But unfortunately, they only have 168 hours in their week. And you don't want 30 of them because people are sleeping. Although with metal, maybe it's only 20 that people are sleeping. But you know what I'm saying.
Yep.
And it's relationships to get on the radio. Taylor Swift wouldn't be Taylor Swift if she didn't get on the radio, which still labels get you on the radio, which you couldn't do for yourself. That's old school and new school. The new school is the Spotify, Apple, Amazon playlists, the editorial. Mm-hmm. How do you get on those playlists? And the great thing about those nowadays is, in addition to getting exposure and marketing, you're also getting money, because each time someone streams that list, you're getting your half a penny. So it's a twofer, which is great. There's a long list. Metal was different because it was more of a niche. Over the years, I noticed that when people were shifting, they sold more cassettes than the average genre of music during the late 80s and early 90s. And then as we pivoted in the late 90s to CD only, uh, they turned around and in the first decade of this century, while everyone started moving to streaming more and more, metal has always lagged. Metal has sold more physical product than most genres of music.
Hmm.
More loyal fan base. I'm sure you saw what Tool did last year. Maybe you didn't.
Not a massive Tool fan, but
Okay, well, Tool, I am. Uh, maybe it's not hard enough for you, but what Tool did when they put out their release in 2019
yeah.
is they sold a lot of physical albums in the streaming era. And what they did is they didn't put out a normal CD at 13.98, 15.98.
Hmm.
They only put out the deluxe version
Right,
for
okay.
$50. And their fans, their brand is so strong,
Hmm.
and the fandom that follows a band like Tool is so committed.
Yeah.
They were number one on the charts. I mean, they sold, I don't remember the exact number, but to me, it was an almost unfathomable number
Hmm.
in the year of 2019. And it wasn't a gimmick like you see a band like BTS doing nowadays.
Hmm.
I mean, it was a real fan type of thing. So metal's different. Its fans are more loyal. They're very loyal to the brand. As I said before, when I go to shows, I'd see label T-shirts as much as I'd see the artist T-shirts. Roadrunner being one of the big label brands, obviously.
Yeah. Yeah.
And their fans are willing to commit. There's a thing called ARPU that everyone looks at now, average revenue per user, ARPU.
Oh.
And what it is since we're not selling much music anymore, instead now we have to sell them something. And you're going to have the 99-cent fan, you're going to have the subscribing fan, and then you're going to have the $150 fan.
Oh, okay.
And if we could be on tour, it could even be more than that.
Hmm.
And you want to sell them merchandise, and you want to sell them almost anything that's. You try to think of unique things you could sell them
Hmm.
to be able to sustain your career, because you can't sustain your career just on selling music anymore, obviously.
No. As you mentioned one thing earlier in terms of like new school versus old school. I'm going to run by you a model Roadrunner art direct signing deal, and you can tell me in your capacity as president of the A2IM whether it would be a viable, equitable outcome these days. So, a new signing for Roadrunner would be 6 to 7 albums usually, with an option after the second. All publishing and IP retained by Roadrunner in perpetuity, and an advance of about $5,000. No touring support guaranteed. Usually they'd provide it, but they wouldn't guarantee it in case they got roped into a shitty tour. Would that be in breach of A2IM's kind of ideal circumstances for the artists these days?
A2IM is the American Association of Independent Music, represents independent labels, not artists.
Ooh, that's a good answer.
That said, you'll have labels, I don't know if you know, like Secretly Canadian, Jaguar, Bon Iver. Do you know who these artists are?
Yeah.
Or they tend to treat their artists better than the major labels do.
Mhm.
The deal you described to me wouldn't be a Roadrunner type deal. That'd be a real indie deal.
Yeah.
It typically wouldn't be 6 to 7 records. It typically would be 2 to 3 records,
Mhm.
or sometimes even just one record. Although there's then a disincentive to invest marketing if you have no futures. And they're only offering $5,000, $10,000, $15,000 advance because that's all they can afford. But the artist, being a creative person with no artist team to speak of backing them up, who's really doing any work, needs some label foundation, because the label does have a staff to do some of that publicity. to make sure the artwork's created. They're just creating the music. So I think the independent music label community is certainly kinder than the major labels. And what you described, I know the name is a 360 deal.
Mm-hmm.
There are 360 deals in the independent community without question, but those 360 deals wouldn't come with a $5,000 or $10,000 advance.
Mm-hmm.
Those would come out with significantly higher advance, plus the work for doing that. If they took the publishing, you'd have to make sure you're with a real label.
Mm-hmm.
But if you sign with the right independent label, if you do the publishing, they'd have an incentive then to get you a lot of synchronization licenses, to get your music into film and TV and ads and placed somewhere, video games, because they'd be sharing in it. Mm-hmm. There'd be an incentive for them to be more involved in your touring and working with your agent. Mm-hmm. Because if they're getting 10 or 15% of your touring revenues as defined, not of gross, that's where a lawyer comes in. If you give away 15% of your gross on your tours, you're basically screwed, right? Yep. But if you give it net after, well, the definitions of gross and net are funny definitions, aren't they? Yeah. But you deal with decent people. Yeah. And I like to think the community that I used to represent at A2IM was a decent community. And let me assure you, there's people who I ignored, who I never went to for membership, and there were actually a few who wanted to become members, who I didn't allow to become members, because they would have sullied the independent music label brand. Obviously, I won't get into names because I don't feel like being sued. But if someone was not reputable, why would you want them to be part of your club, which A2IM is a club?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, of course. One of the things that I was really impressed by when I was listening to you talk about with the A2IM stuff is how effectively you can rattle off the statistics of that year in terms of market share, export market share, independent music market share, and the kind of the valuation of that industry. Now, my question is kind of like, it's a bit of a pithy question, because one thing I try and do is I try and really contextualize the Roadrunner story for the time. So I'm trying to figure out, where did you get those numbers? I know the RIAA published quite comprehensive reports on the industry, but I'm not sure where I could find that understanding and that data on a European level and a worldwide level.
The answer is you probably can't. In the U.S., what we had, well, number one, have you heard of an organization called Merlin?
No.
Okay, so there's A2IM, and then in the UK there's AIM. I'm sure you've heard of AIM, AIM, which is the original, not the original, but the first big. The AIM actually preceded A2IM by about 4 or 5 years. It was started by a woman named Alison Wenham, who's really terrific. And so she, in addition to starting AIM, started this international network. So we'd get together once a year, typically in New York, and people would come from Australia and Brazil and all around the country, and we'd meet. And we'd formed an organization called WIN, the World Independent Network.
Oh, okay.
And then to make sure, one of the benefits of being with a music label, as long as we're back there, is it's not a statutory rate that's paid by Spotify. So if each individual little label did a deal, would they get the same deal as Universal Music is getting? No. So the answer is they formed Merlin, and Merlin, on behalf of all these independent labels that decided to throw their hat in, and then they were able to get, saying, okay, now we represent X percent of the market. But in the U.S., it wasn't so bad because we have Nielsen SoundScan. Now it's MRC. The company's changed ownership, Nielsen MRC. And but even that was controversial, Jim. You did hit a point. We did it not based on distribution, but by master ownership. The majors would claim if they're So RED is now owned by Sony, so they would claim market share for something they don't own. We'd say, no, no, no. Who owns that master at Glassnote that has
Okay.
Glassnote has Phoenix and what's the big band? It's a UK band, and I can't explain Mumford & Son.
Right, okay.
Mumford & Son and Phoenix and those bands are signed to Glassnote Records.
Mm-hmm.
So we included them in our market share, even though they were distributed by an arm of Sony Music's independent distribution.
Right, okay. So what you're saying is if I'm going to go out looking for some comprehensive data on the music industry and numbers for either this year or reverse years, it might not be a worthwhile venture because it's currently up for debate exactly where the boundaries are drawn.
You should contact, I'll give you another name. I'm giving you too many people to contact.
Hey, it's fine. I love this. It's great.
Contact Merlin. There's a fellow by the name of Jim Mahoney.
Okay.
He's based here in the U.S. If you need his contact information, I'll send it to you.
Perfect.
But if you contact Jim Mahoney, he could tell you a lot about Merlin and how they come up with their market share numbers.
Cool.
Jim actually previously was my number 2 at A2IM.
Right, okay.
And, when we grew, there's a lot of incest among these organizations about people moving in and out.
Absolutely. All right, I think I've milked you dry for education. unless there's something you wanted to cover and I've just interrupted your train of thought.
No.
Is there any? Have you got any memories of Jules while we're here?
It's funny. Jules, a very bright guy. If you read the articles you saw, I referred to him as an industry character because Jules was a character. By the time I got to Jules, so when Roadrunner started, they were a really bare bones organization of 3-4 people in this country. They started very small. Doug wasn't with them back then. Holly Lane, as you noted, was, may she rest in peace, nice lady. Was one of the starting employees. Doug didn't come in for 2 or 3 years. You can clarify that with him. And Jules was doing all the deals, both artist deals as well as the distribution deal. Doug, while not a finance person by by education, had an unbelievably sharp business sense. So after a while, he started becoming what I call the business affairs portion. So when I negotiated the distribution deal, Jules may have been there or may not have been there. This was back in '90. But Doug really knew what the main parameters were, the 6 or 7 things that were important. Same thing with the artist deals. Doug would have to say, okay, here's the royalty rate we're willing to give them for X number of albums. Here's the advance, all the criteria, how much we're going to spend on marketing. And he would actually do a P&L of what he expected. Jules then would do not the business affairs, the negotiation side, but the contract drafting side.
Okay.
Always a very fair guy, very ethical, very smart. But by the time I got to really know Jules, it was the second decade of Roadrunner, and he was edging toward retirement. He was almost done at that point. He was doing a lot with Holly at Mechanic Records at that point, and we distributed them as well. I mean, we distributed a lot of labels, so I dealt with Jules not just at Roadrunner, but I dealt with him at other companies as well. Someone I always respected, someone I always enjoyed. Case Wessels, someone I always respected, someone I always enjoyed. Very good guy, very good to his employees, and good to his artists, really cared. Occasionally you go off. You alluded in your email about when Roadrunner would change his repertoires and try to expand. And I remember one of the first bands they signed was sort of a punky band. Now, to me, punk is like good punk, like Bad Religion. That's good punk to me. You may not like punk at all. I don't know your music.
I like a bit of punk, but I'm with you. Bad Religion is good punk.
Right. He signed a band called Star Star here in New York. You never heard of, and don't bother looking them up. Uh, yeah, that was a pretty lousy record. Case spent, obviously, the marketing dollars are much more because you're dealing with more commercial radio
Yeah.
as opposed to dealing with SOU and metal radio. Just the marketing costs exponentially were like 3 or 4 times what they would have invested in a metal band.
Hmm.
And it sold nothing because I've never met the people from Star Star. I don't even know if they still exist 30 years later, but it wasn't very good. So, but then of course he had Nickelback and made a small fortune. So I guess branching out isn't always a bad thing.
Yeah, sure, sure. I'm kind of intrigued by Mechanic, because I I remember when I was reading up on obviously Holly Depart. I think it was it Steve I don't think it was Steve Sinclair, was it, who started?
Yes, it was. Yes,
I've
Steve.
got the
Yes.
names right. Great. It's coming into my memory. It's great. The remarkable thing was how they were with IRD from the go. So as soon as Holly walks out of Roadrunner into Mechanic, we've got ourselves like a business model that's completely viable with some reputable names behind it. Holly and Steve were very well respected in the community at the time, but Mechanic didn't really churn out more than, say, 20 records before it wrapped up over a period of years. So I'm kind of intrigued as to how it didn't work out, really. Maybe I'm speaking out of turn. I don't know.
No, you're not speaking out of turn at all. Their A&R never really. What they have? Twister, Trickster,
They had
and one other.
was it Violence?
Oh, Voivod.
Voivod.
No, Voivod. Whatever. They had Trickster. They had some successes, and then, like often happens with music labels, their A&R went sort of cold, and you still have to pay everybody's salaries, and you start losing on every record. And then he got a big influx. I think he went with RCA, which sort of you're going full circle to your earlier comment about Epic and Sepultura. RCA really didn't know what to do with Mechanic's label, and so this, you give it to the salespeople. The great thing the sales force at IRD was passionate about the music. They weren't just salesmen. I later, as I told you earlier, worked for Sony Music Distribution. Some of those people, they could have been selling widgets. It really made no difference. They were just selling music, whether they liked it or not. Mm-hmm. The people at Red, for 90% of the releases, were passionate about the releases.
Yeah.
Really were able to describe them to the people at the retailers who would bring them in, know which ones to push, know which ones not to push, which could get them in trouble because they were supposed to push everything. And I think that's what happened to Mechanic. The A&R went sort of cold, and then on top of that, Steve Sinclair may disagree. And actually, the last time I saw Steve Sinclair was at a little get-together we had for Jules after Jules passed away that Holly had set up. So that was a number of years ago. But good guy. He's no longer. Lots of people have left the music business. So.
Yeah, man. That's why we got to have these conversations so we can gather the knowledge and before it leaves. Because one of the big gaps, massive gaps in this story is the band Carnivore, which is obviously the Typo Negative predecessor. I don't know, and I don't think I'll ever know how they got signed, because I reckon Jules was involved, and obviously Pete Steele's no longer with us. And in terms of the personnel around, I just don't think there's anyone around to tell that story anymore. The managers, the Carnivore managers passed away. Could be something lost to time.
When were they signed?
84, I think. Maybe 83, and the first album in 84.
Well, then I'll bet you that you'll be able to find that answer out from Doug Keogh.
Oh, really? When I do loop around to him, I will ask him. Anyone who's like directly under the employ of Roadrunner, I do ask that question as like a cursory, just in case. Do you know how this happened? So
it was great. Case with Typo Negative was the first Roadrunner band to go gold in the United States.
Yeah.
And Case made a deal as an incentive with the salespeople. He said, if you guys can make this a gold record within the next 2 years, I'll fly all the salespeople to Amsterdam for a weekend.
No way. That's awesome.
And they did, and he did. And it was funny because at that point, originally, when he agreed to do it, there were maybe, I'm making up a number, but let's say there were 18 salespeople.
Mm-hmm.
IRD had branches. There was New York, there was Chicago, there was Atlanta, San Francisco, LA. Maybe there were 18 salespeople, 20 salespeople. 2 years later, there were like 36 salespeople. and Case laughed about it with me, but was a very good sport about the whole thing. He said, listen, I made the commitment. And he flew everyone over to Amsterdam, and they had a wonderful, they flew over on a Thursday night. They stayed up Friday, Saturday, and late on Sunday, they flew back. Yeah. And if you want to know more about the legal side, Doug knows everything. Sure. But another reason he was less involved is Ray Garcia was the inside. Eventually, Roadrunner became so big that they brought a lawyer in on staff, and that was Ray Garcia. Oh, man, excellent guy, and could probably tell you more stories about Jules than I can, although Doug could tell you stories about all of them. But Ray would definitely be a contact for you.
Definitely, just noted his name down. That's brilliant. Yeah, the one thing I'm going to ask Doug as well, from a distribution standpoint, this might be outside of your remit as you will have moved on at this point. But as you moved into the 2000s, the liner notes and the actual packaging for the records gets a lot more. You get a lot more bang for your buck. We move away from like just little slide-in pieces of paper, and now we're getting full booklets with context, lyrics, and artwork and things like that.
At that point, the pendulum had sort of swung from Doug. Well, number one, that was part of the evolution of the music industry. I don't think that was just Roadrunner. I think everyone was doing more and more deluxe as we started moving to this ARPU concept that I told you. But Jonas moved from being the marketing person to being the head person, the president of Roadrunner Records. And Jonas being a marketing person, those things were more important to him.
Yeah.
So he was willing to spend your extra 10, 20 cents that you described before with your coloring, and felt that he'd get a return on his investment on that.
Well, he certainly did from me. That was my era. That's where I sunk my pocket money.
Good. And it's, I wish there were more people like you nowadays for the music industry, because I still have friends who work in it. I'm on the other side of midnight at this point. I'm in my late 60s at this point. So, but I enjoyed being in the industry. I was there. Before that, I was in film. So I had an interesting career. That's enough for me at this point in my life.
Yeah. I've got one more question, which I ask everyone, and then I'm happy to let you go, Richard, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Have you ever seen a ghost?
I don't believe so. Why?
No, I ask everyone, and the responses range from, yeah, I've seen 10. Here's 3 pictures from that evening, and all the way to, no, that's ridiculous.
I wouldn't say it's ridiculous, but I've seen images, but I think they were in my mind. Maybe I should have eaten those mushrooms, right? No, I don't think I don't believe I've ever seen a ghost.
Oh, that's a shame. But
I'm not that skeptical to say that I'm not a. That's absurd. Your earlier comment.
There's still time then.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you very much, Richard. Enjoy the rest of your day.